Welcome, data enthusiasts. I'm Joseph from Zuma, and this is Data for Good. Our podcast is brought to you by Zuma. We're a dedicated recruitment consultancy for senior data, insights, and analytics professionals, connecting you with Berlin's most influential and innovative companies. On today's Data for Good podcast, I'm pleased to be joined by a very cool cat, Nikolas Schriefer. He is VP of Product and Data at Linkfire in Berlin. Linkfire is an incredibly powerful music marketing platform connecting artists, labels, and fans in the music production lifecycle. Whew, that was long. Nikolas, how's it going today?
Very well. Thank you, Joseph. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Oh, good. Yeah, good to hear it. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Sure, yeah.
To begin, could you tell us about your own unique journey? How did you first discover your kind of passion for the world of data?
Yeah, happy to do that. I guess when I remember back as a kid, even I was always I always liked puzzles, from building Lego blocks to solving math problems and stats. And then I also focused on statistics in my economic studies. And I would say even took a data-driven approach to musical composition. So I was kind of doubling in music and in economics when going to college. I guess as a first actual business application, I used data when I then saw a problem in the live music market, which was around how concerts and tours were planned and booked. Because I saw that as a very not data-driven approach, very much based on traditional old contacts, not very outcome focused, and then using data to the bookers or even the artists and the manager's advantage. So I actually decided to leverage data, but also technology to build an app that matches concert venues and artists. That was the main idea. So essentially a type of a recommender system based on collaborative filtering in that particular way. And then I actually built a company around that, which quickly moved away from that original product idea, which I guess happens in startups. So we pivoted and ultimately built advertising technology, but we always had data at the core of our value generation and products.
Incredible. And throughout your career, seemingly, you've been able to constantly tack back to music and use data to help in that kind of that other passion pursuit of yours. I have seen actually that the ticketing world for music venues has evolved, as it should do, from paper to paperless, quite significantly in the last few years as well. Yeah, and you're no doubt a part of that. And the recommender system as well, that's a large part of data science, right? So yeah, it all ties in very nicely, and you've been doing it for years.
Yeah, definitely. It is a large part in the music industry too nowadays. It has changed quite a bit, as you mentioned, in ticketing, but also in recorded music. I guess with Spotify, we all know about the music discovery algorithms that are being used there, whether it comes to playlist curation, which are to a large part algorithmic by now, but then also in the ticketing space and the marketing, of course, being able to really see how can we attribute the marketing dollars we spend to the conversions driven in the end, which is also something that's really important for us at Linkfire, being able to really track this down for the customers that we work with and using data to show to them how their marketing campaigns are doing and how they could optimize it and improve in the future.
So many ideas are coming to mind. I'm also thinking I have a friend who has just set up an online ticketing company in Australasia, in New Zealand. I think I should plug him into this conversation at a later stage as well. And I'm understanding why you've chosen today's topic to be data mesh in practice. So yes, today we will be talking about data mesh in practice along with data as a product. Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to you connect all the dots. So with that, from a high level, and then we can go deeper, data mesh, in your understanding, what is it?
Right. So let's try to untangle that a bit, because it's obviously quite a hyped concept over the last 2.5 years or so, and a lot of companies tried to implement it, and I think everybody in data is at least somewhat thinking about it. I think the combination of what you mentioned and proposed around the data mesh in practice and data as a product is a really good one, because data as a product is in fact one of the core principles of data mesh. But maybe before we go to the principles, we could, like, where does the data mesh even come from? So, I mean, at least I heard about it for the first time from Zhemak Deghani's article. I think it was late 2019 already that she wrote about it. So she was a consultant at ThoughtWorks at the time, working with a lot of, I think, mostly large enterprise type clients, which are always seeing similar problems when it came to using their data, especially for analytical purposes. And then she thought about, kind of in a memo to herself, but then also to the greater world, about approaches to tackle those problems or those challenges that came up. And then she proposes I think she calls it a socio-technical approach, because it has obviously tech as its core. So it's about how can we design and create a technical architecture that allows us to leverage data in the best possible way as we intended. But that doesn't go by itself. Like, it needs to be coupled with a sociological change within companies, which is a lot about people, it's about processes, it's about the culture. And if I remember this correctly, there are 4 main principles around the data mesh. One that we already talked about is data as a product. So what does as a product even mean? Maybe we go there a bit later and we can talk a bit more about that, because that's a whole session in itself, I presume. I would say very generally, product thinking means thinking about the customer first. Like, who are the users and the customers of the data of the product that I'm providing? What are their needs? What are their problems? And how can we as a team solve those with data, with technology, with products? There are 3 other important principles in the data mesh, also from the original article already. And I think the main one, the first one mentioned, is a decentralized organization, a decentralized organization around domains. So we're trying to figure out, how can we cluster, how can we group the data assets and also the data use cases that we have, decentralize the ownership around those, because decentralized ownership is, I think, a concept that in software engineering is around for quite a while already, when we all were starting to do agile and microservices, and we figured out that we can actually be much faster. We have smaller teams that have autonomy, that are empowered to own a particular piece of the software on their own. And the same thing is something that we now, with this approach, I think at the core of the data mesh approach is to apply this to the data world as well. And then there are 2 more principles even. One is around the piece of governance, right? So if everything, the ownership is decentralized and the production of data and data assets and data products is decentralized, still in a company, we need some way to glue all of this together, to have global standards. And the idea here is to have global standards that work in a federated way. So we have the decentralized assets, we have a global governance as well, and that works hand in hand together. And then the 4th piece, just to wrap this up around, like, what is data mesh, and like, it's a bit of a longer explanation, but I think it's important to mention, is the infrastructure. That here to remain efficient and to not duplicate efforts and like build the same infrastructure n times, depending on how many decentralized data sub-products and teams you have, they still want to share a centralized, in the best case, self-service infrastructure, so that certain, I would say, use cases or resources can be shared, and thus the efficiency in the organization can be maximized.
Interesting. I don't think I've seen an easy way of defining data mesh. So talking through the 4 principles is absolutely necessary. If we might relate this to data mesh in practice. How far along is Linkfire in terms of integrating or embedding data mesh as an approach?
I would say we have onboarded on that journey roughly a year ago, and we've come a long way, but there's also still a lot of room to develop.
Okay.
Like we started to think about that because like what I just described, like the agility and flexibility and speed around using data was not the reality a year ago. Like data was, and I've heard that from a lot of other companies as well that I talked to, like other data and product leaders in the space, that data just like naturally was a byproduct. Like we were thinking about building software, discovering software, delivering software, and then, well, there was some data being produced. And oftentimes it would then sit with a small or larger group in a centralized manner. And Linkfire, it's sat within the finance department, and they were mainly working on reports and audits of that data. But we weren't really using the data to our advantage, like really leveraging it to come up with new ideas, and to get inspired and build upon it and leverage it. And there were also a couple of issues that we saw. Like the business grew a lot over the past couple of years, so the volume of data obviously increased. And that's also something that I've seen with other companies. The complexity increased. The demands for data explode, right? There's like a lot of stakeholders that want data because everybody wants to do data-driven or data-informed decisions. And that leads to a lot of challenges. Like the architecture is under stress, oftentimes maybe doesn't meet the requirements anymore. A request explodes, so you create bottlenecks with the central BI team or a central data team. And generally, like I like this metric of time to insight. That is one that increases a lot if you don't have your data in a way that it can be discovered, accessed, and used in this decentralized way that then the data mesh proposes.
Time to insight. Is that a term that I should know?
I don't know if it's a well-defined term. It's one of the KPIs, some way that we use at Linkfire to track also the quality and the productivity of the data operations, like, and the architecture and the structure of the data that we set up, which, I mean, it can be measured from a survey perspective. So it's more of a perception, like how fast, like as a stakeholder, we ask all the stakeholders that work with data, which is essentially everybody in the company. Like, if you want to make a data-driven decision, how fast do you get access to the data? How fast can you actually use the data? How valuable is the data to you that helps you to actually make that decision? And there's some parts in between that you can measure a bit more objectively, but then it gets a bit more complicated as well.
It's interesting. Earlier you said about data used to be a byproduct or an afterthought, and now everybody is using the data. It reminds me, I used to recruit for software development, and even in software development, data was just a part of the tasks that needed to be managed. It wasn't something of great consideration. I'm probably going back 4 or 5 years now, but it's interesting how it has evolved, and data mesh is now integral clearly to Linkfire. What have, other than efficiency and time to insight and removing bottlenecks, what are the implications of data mesh on an organization?
They're pretty big. It's not a small change to an organization because it touches so many different areas, and it's also not something you can do fast. Like I would say we started a year ago, and we have seen a lot of improvements, which we can also measure in the outcomes, which is great. I think that's something that's important along the way, which is also like around this mindset of treating your operations as a product. Maybe even if we want to go there, it's like measuring, like what is the outcome here? What are our goals? What do we want to achieve? And then establishing some metrics that you can track along the way, how you get there.
Is that funny because operations isn't conventionally seen as a revenue generation activity?
Yeah, that's
or because maybe operations doesn't like to be accountable, or what's your thinking behind that?
It's a good point. I mean, even with data, then specifically the combination of data and operations, like you need to, and we needed to at Linkfire a year ago, make a case. Like, why do we want something like data mesh, which we embedded it actually into a more holistic data strategy where data mesh was one part of it. But I remember we had this pitch then where we essentially pitched the management team the changes to the data, which then even like really went into company strategy, which we wanted to do. And I remember that we essentially built up our pitch on 3 pillars. One was the already mentioned data is the volumes are exploding, everything gets much more complex, and we are at risk of systems failure if we don't do something about this. And then the second was around the inefficiencies that we also touched on, that we are spending a lot of time just finding the right data sets, data assets that we need to make decisions that we want to make. And the third one was then around the opportunity, where it's more like you were asking the revenue generating aspect. How can we use data to drive the business outcomes we want to drive in the future? And the 2 main concepts or methods that we proposed there and have by now also implemented are around experimentation. The data helps us to make many more experiments much quicker, and especially a data infrastructure that is set up in a decentralized and self-serve accessible way helps us to make many more experiments much more quicker. And many experiments means we learn a lot, we can iterate, we can improve our products as we go, which is something that with Agile, we want to do anyway. We have the smaller team so that they can deliver and release something into production at least every 2 weeks. And that comes from the software world. But I think using the data in terms of experimentation is necessary. It's not the cherry on top. Like, we need to have that in order to be able to reliably, constantly, continuously improve on the basis of experimentation. And the second pillar was in terms of revenue generation is ML, machine learning. So how can we use data that then feeds into models that we build that in turn also helps us to improve our product and our processes?
Interesting, making operations integral to this whole data mesh topic as well, and that gives rise, I assume, to the new position that we see, data operations manager.
Yes, I mean, managing that change alone, right? Like, it's a big endeavor, and I think you need also a person that has this as a dedicated part of their responsibilities. And I think it fits very well the mindset and the general responsibilities of someone working in operations. And also here I'm borrowing a bit from what we have seen in product maybe a few years ago already, with product operations becoming more en vogue in a way. And we can apply, I think, the same principles and also the same goals and the same improvements from that to the data world.
Interesting. How have you approached the process of introducing and communicating data mesh? You know, it's obviously had a big impact on the business. You've been doing it a year. There's been lots of parties or lots of stakeholders involved in embedding this. How did you introduce and communicate the data mesh approach to the operational people, say like me in the business? And how did that go down with them?
Right.
Was it difficult for them to grasp?
Yeah, it's a really good and big question, I would say. So how we did it, and I think there's probably a ton of different ways to do it as well. We recognized some of those issues with data reliability, complexity, volumes, and essentially I then called for a task force. So we formed a small group with 4 people from different areas in the company to figure out what can we do. And from that task force, we created this pitch that I mentioned. So very important for us was to, before we can even roll out anything or make any promises or commitments, we need buy-in from management of the company, because it was this pretty big architectural and organizational and also cultural change that we were proposing. So that, I think, is something that we needed. And then the question, all right, was how do we operationalize this? What did we do then, basically? And there's a couple things. First, how do we even organize the data? There are a couple of theoretical exercises that we needed to do, like starting very practically from like listing all the data assets that we have and trying to come up with smart or reasonable ways to cluster them into domains. And I think one learning here for me was to not cluster it from a perspective of origin or source of data, but cluster it from a perspective of use of data. What happens with this data? And if the two data sets are used by the same customers in similar ways, for example, like you can think about if you have to join two data sets very often, they're probably close together for the use cases that you want to achieve. Mm-hmm. And that way we created clusters of the data. And then we actually went out of the data and looked at the product engineering organization. And that's why we also had people from those parts of the business in this task force that I mentioned. So we try to then cluster a bit broader even. And I think that is something that is not maybe the textbook data mesh, but it's something that made sense for us at the time because we wanted to, the goal was to figure out how do we build an organization that allows for maximum value through data and through software and through products at the same time. And then we essentially came out with a new proposal how to kind of create a domain of domains or cluster of clusters. Like the data clustered in one group and then cluster the different groups of data together with different products and services that we have. And we came up with a concept we called those value streams then, because they were inherently pursuing the same goals in terms of value creation for our end customers. And those value streams then were really cross-functional teams, including product, data, engineers, but also commercial functions like sales and customer success. And one thing that we also proposed in that and what we then did when rolling it out was breaking up the central data organization that we had and decentralizing that. That actually, I think, very much in line with what the data mesh is all about. So very practically, we added a data analyst to each of those value streams. We added a data engineer to each of those value streams, which were before that in centralized teams.
Mm-hmm. So put together a task force. The task force does lots of research and seemingly some, at least operational change, creating the value streams and appreciating the value of, or appreciating that there is cross-functionality in lots of the data that's used, hence the clusters. Okay, you'd mentioned earlier people, process, culture being a large part of this data mesh concept. So what was the impact on these teams, other than, say, data stakeholders like engineers and analysts being tacked onto these value streams? What was the impact on teams at Linkfire, and even the positions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would probably take this in two ways. There's an impact in terms of the internal structures of the teams, and there is an impact in terms of how the teams then interface with their stakeholders that are external to the team. So internally, we talked a bit, and you just mentioned it. Of course, it's a big change for the data analysts now to not work in their primary team, not being the other data analyst anymore, but the value stream. So the team which is cross-functional together with the product managers, engineers, and other functions. Same with the data engineers. We tried, however, to also keep the functional alignment really close. So like in the end, it's a typical matrix organization that we created. We have a cross-functional vertical team, and then we have functional horizontal. We call those communities of practice. I think the old Spotify model is chapters, but yeah, everybody calls them a bit differently. So we opted for tribes, which could be. Yeah, I think tribes is a bit ambiguous. I think some companies it's a group of cross-functional teams, and for other companies it might be a group of functional teams. So it's a bit difficult, like what a tribe is.
Okay, noted. Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, so we tried to really establish those communities of practice. We don't lose the touch. So the analysts should obviously still talk to each other and exchange knowledge in a very frequent way and learn from what the others were doing in their respective value streams. However, the primary team that they should also feel part of and feel ownership in was the value generating team, the value stream that we created. I think that was one big change. And the other was also from the stakeholder perspective. Now, like one very specific thing that we did is we created a process to request data or to request analyses from the teams. Because before that, it was a bit like we had a Slack channel for all the analysts, and then someone would just drop a question there, hey, can you find me this and this data that I'm looking for? And we changed that and formalized that process a bit, that you go through certain, like, you have to classify the request that you have, and the request then goes also to the team. And the request of data and anything that happens with data is also here treated as a product, to come back to that theme, which means it's being prioritized by the team in that particular effort led by the product manager, and then slotted into, well, essentially the discovery or delivery process that they were running in the team. So that was a different thinking from the stakeholder perspective that they also had to adapt.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of adaptation on the stakeholders' part, and maybe even stakeholders that don't fully grasp the importance and criticality of data in their daily work. I know we're educated to really value data these days, but I don't think people get it quite as much as the data professionals who are working to enhance the value of this data every day. So it makes me wonder, maybe you're still on this educational journey, but you are a year in. Are there any things that you might have done differently, either in the execution or the communication or any other area of this implementation?
I think we could have even earlier included some even more diverse functions in the process of exploring the data mesh. So I was talking about this task force. I think the task force was a bit working in isolation. I think there we could have made an effort to actually include more people more early on, also in preparing them for a larger change to happen, which would have probably given us a bit of a head start in the very beginning. Because now you're completely right. We needed to obviously educate and communicate a lot, and we are still doing that. And also, I think a part that we maybe overlooked a bit in the beginning, but now have implemented more thoroughly in companies, also the whole idea around data literacy or data proficiency, that it is not about the data professionals alone, not someone who has data in their title should be able to work with data, but essentially it's for everyone. The cool thing, at least at Linkfire, is that everyone, I think, understands that and also wants that. Everyone wants to work with data. They want to make data-informed decisions. So that's really cool. There's a high motivation of kind of, let's say, rolling into this like data education program. And I think that is something where we are still very much at the beginning, is like, how does such a education program look like? Like what curriculum can we have for the whole company, for the whole organization, to make everybody able to really leverage data to make better decisions, which that would be my ultimate goal to achieve.
You guys perhaps should give yourselves a pat on the back. It sounds like you've done an excellent job on the education piece. If you have got people highly motivated to want to make this work and to want to gain more rich insight and value from the data, then that's a great place to be in. I commend you on that for real.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm especially happy to see, for example, product managers to really go into our analytics tools and our visualization tools and are able to find the data they need to make decisions themselves and like really into that. And in the process, we also actually bought or licensed a new product analytics tool that we use within the application that we have. And like seeing the product managers and also other members of the teams go in there, check particular data points, metrics, statistics they're interested in because they are trying to answer a question, and then finding the data now themselves in a quick manner, being able to make this decision quickly. That's just great to see.
Yeah, fantastic. You mentioned the product managers, and of course, one of the principles of data mesh is data as a product. Can you think of well, I guess you could only relate it to your own experience with Linkfire. So could you think of an outcome that the customer might see of data mesh at Linkfire?
Oh yes, totally. Like because data is not only at the heart of the product development process for us, but it's also a part of the product. I would say basically all the products at Linkfire are data products in a way that data is at the core of it. Like we were talking about the marketing campaigns, right? For a label manager, a label marketing manager trying to figure out, does the campaign that they're running on social media or somewhere else, like how is it working? So of course we have an insights piece within the application that they use at Linkfire where they can see exactly where people are coming from that visit their links, where they're going to, what music they are streaming, relating that back. So that is, I think, in a very narrow sense, even a data product where the customer is now able to use the data that informs their decision making. So not just our internal, but also for the end consumer.
Fascinating. Music platforms, and I guess the most notable one is Spotify. It really is relatable to somebody like me, a user. I can see how data it is optimized and enhanced every day when I use it with the recommendations that you mentioned earlier today.
Right. Just to maybe add another use case for you here, because we were now talking about the B2B case, like the label manager, the consumer. You as a fan, of course, if you interface with a Linkfire link, like you click on your favorite artists, like link in bio and Instagram, for example, and takes you to a Linkfire link. That experience that you then have, it's kind of an interstitial, like a mini website that we create that then contains a bunch of content pieces, which then brings you to other music destinations like Spotify or Apple Music or Amazon Music, or even adjacent like fields, other parts or destinations of content discovery that you might be interested in, that might be valuable to you. And that's obviously a highly dynamic product. Like your experience should not look the same like my experience, anybody else's experience. So to contextualize that is, of course, I mean, that is a data challenge. That's actually also one of the areas where we apply machine learning to optimize that particular user experience to whatever any given user at any given point in time needs on that particular page.
It's also relatable because music is such an emotive thing in people's lives and such a personal thing, and data mesh with data as a product helps to personalize that experience through what the user sees is essentially just an app.
Yeah, exactly.
You
want to abstract all the complexity, and I think that's another thing. I think making it simple is important in all areas for the user, but also internally.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. And helpful, I imagine, the simplification. In the interest of time, me and you can go offline and talk about this forever.
Yeah, sure.
For our podcasts, for our listeners and viewers of the podcast, we typically finish with an advice question. It strikes me that you could well have a lot of advice about implementing the data mesh approach, with or without that. I wonder, from what you've experienced in the data product domain, what advice would you give to data professionals working with this approach?
Yeah, I would probably give a twofold advice. One that's really for everyone and like takes this concept of data as a product. So I would say really always try to find out how you as a data professional and also the data that you work with adds value. So is useful for the ultimate customer and user of that data. Like that should always be the first step in my mind. And then you can work backwards from that. So don't start with the source or the origin of the data. How does that look like? But really, how is the data being used? How does it create value? It's like that's also one of the most important principles in my mind in product management and product development is how to create value. And because we also now talking a lot about implementing the data mesh, there was just like one other thing that really strikes me and I think is at the heart of implementing a change like this. And it's essentially Conway's law. right? So Conway's law says that like any system that you're trying to design will be constrained by the organizational structure that designs it. And that is very true for implementing something like the data mesh as well. Like you cannot implement data mesh or decentralize your data domains without thinking about how does your organization like need to look like so you can even achieve what you're trying to achieve down the line.
Interesting. So for that data as a product professional, always be considering how does this data add value, and with that, how is it being used to add value? Very good, very nice. Nikolas, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for educating me and hopefully our listeners as well about the operational and cultural aspects of data mesh, something that's a bit more relatable for me.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. It was a pleasure.
Cool. Awesome. I also suggest for anybody who's interested and has any questions or comments to leave feedback, either through our LinkedIn page or through Spotify or through YouTube, certainly. Connect with us somehow. It's a conversation that is definitely going to become more prominent for a whole array of businesses, at least for the coming few years. So once again, thanks very much, Nikolas, and see you all next time.